I find the keynote on Tisha B'Av morning often to be very difficult to connect with. Today's a day where we're supposed to be sad and feeling raw emotions and connecting with Jewish history. And there's an intensity of emotion that we're supposed to feel on Tisha B'Av. And I oftentimes struggle to connect with that through Kinnot. And I think there's a few different reasons why that's the case. One of which is we're fasting, and that makes everything more difficult. The other is that we read them really quickly. There's a lot of Hebrew, and it gets read at a breakneck pace that is very difficult for me to keep up with, even just sounding out the words. But it's not just the speed of the Hebrew, it's actually the Hebrew itself. Because we only read it once a year, we don't really have the opportunity to get used to saying these words and to begin to have at least even the brain space to think about what they might mean. And even if we did have the time to do it, it's actually really difficult Hebrew. The Hebrew itself is not really the same as biblical Hebrew. It's not even similar to, for people who are familiar with or able to read Gemara really well, it's not really like the same as Gemara. It's definitely not modern Hebrew. It's this very difficult, maybe medieval, maybe Gaonic Hebrew that uses some very rare words, and that makes it really difficult for us when we read it to understand what it is we're saying. And even then, in addition to that, it's poetry, right? So it's not even like we're reading a Hebrew that's going to be telling us a story that has a clear linear progression. But when we read Kinnot, what we're actually reading are poems. And this kind of makes the whole endeavor of Kinnot even more complicated. Because what's poetry? Poetry is a kind of writing that is supposed to evoke feeling in the reader or the listener. And feeling, that kind of a rush of emotion that you're supposed to get from reading or experiencing poetry, is supposed to be spontaneous. That the act of listening is supposed to bring out a feeling in you. However, oftentimes in order to understand what I'm supposed to experience when I hear or read that poetry, it actually requires deep, careful literary analysis. I'm going to take a careful look at the poem and see, where did the author use a specific word? Where did they pause break the line or pause the, right? Poetry is written with a very clear, a very complicated form. And so whenever we do poetry, we are trying to have a balance between, on the one hand, analyzing the poem so that we can kind of arrive at an intellectual, cognitive conclusion about what the poem is talking about, and balancing that with the spontaneous feeling that that's supposed to evoke within us. And so oftentimes when people study poetry, you first need to invest time in learning and understanding so that at the next time when you read the poem, it can evoke those feelings and experiences within you. And theoretically, that's what Kinnot are supposed to be like. We're supposed to be able somehow to appreciate them as poems. Theoretically, Tisha B'Av morning should really be one big poetry slam. That's really what Kinnot are. I see Amanda's laughing, right? Like, that's really what Kinnot are supposed to be like. We even set the mood up for that. We're sitting on the floor. It's kind of dark. We're supposed to have this emotive experience. But what really stands in the way is the time to spend to analyze them, which we're hopefully going to do together this afternoon, but also the barriers of language and form and different poetic styles than maybe what we're used to today. So what we're going to be doing in the next, as many minutes as we have together, is that we're going to try to shift our perspective from thinking of Kinnot as a lot of Hebrew words that we read really quickly, or maybe even a tefillah, right? They're not a tefillah. You don't have to say every word. There's no requirement to go from beginning to end without speaking, right? That's not what they are. And instead begin to look at Kinnot as poetry. And that will hopefully deepen our appreciation for these very complex texts, and even without knowing every word, be able to take ownership of one or two of the Kinnot, so that we maybe next year, or maybe this afternoon, can recite them and maybe bring out from within us some of the emotion that the poetry is supposed to bring. So this class is going to be really designed as a workshop. So I really invite some hands-on participation, which therefore, please turn on your videos. I always ask, I love to see your face. I'm so happy to see so many faces. I'm also in my Tisha B'Av best, but we're all happy to see everyone's faces. So I'm going to share one more time in the chat the source sheet if you don't have it. Here we go. Desktop. I have too many things on my desktop. Here we go. Open. Okay. The source sheet is going to be in the chat in just one moment. So the way we're going to begin is by reviewing together some literary devices, meaning ways that poetry is written, and think about why that device would be used in order to just build a toolbox for us of a sense of what kinds of literary elements we might see when we look at a Kinnah. And this is important for us to do because the literary elements that the people who write Kinnot write are maybe different than the ones that we might have in modern day poetry or even in a Shakespearean sonnet. So I've made for us to use a list of literary devices to look out for in Kinnot. So this list, let's review this list together. So the first thing, it's in alphabetical order, is an acrostic. So an acrostic is an ABC form. We're going to see many examples of that. Many of the Kinnot are written in an acrostic form. And what's interesting about the fact that we use this form in Kinnot is that when you use the acrostic form in modern poetry, it's considered a very elementary form. It's like a cute thing that little kids do, is they make an acrostic A, B, C, D, E. But like sophisticated poets nowadays don't use an acrostic form. However, this is very much not the case for the people who are writing the Kinnot, for many reasons that we might have time to discuss. But the most traditional of which is that Eicha, the Book of Lamentations, which we base so much of our practice on Tisha B'Av around, is itself written in an acrostic. And so really writing acrostic Kinnot is in keeping with a tradition that we will hopefully have a chance to reflect on in a moment. Actually, let's take a look at it now. So on your source sheet, the Rav writes in the Kinnot book that many of us have been using. He writes, he talks about why alphabetical order is so significant. And the Rav talks about how it is really an expression of humility on our part, that we know that we can never use language to fully describe God, let's say, right? Ashrei is written as an acrostic. We could never fully describe how amazing God is. And so we limit ourselves to an acrostic to say that we are limited by language. Language is composed of the letters of the alphabet. Those are the only tools that we have to express ourselves. And even though, let's say, God is greater than what we can express, we're going to do our best with what we have, and then we stop. And similarly, the pain we feel over the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash is too much for us to truly be able to articulate. And that's why Eicha was written as an acrostic, says the Rav, because we recognize that we are confined within language, and we're going to do our best to describe what it is that was so painful, that painful experience of the Korban, but then we are going to stop. So that's one reason to think about why we're using an acrostic. In addition to using an acrostic, another literary device that we can look out for when we look at Kinnot is allusion. So that's references in general. An allusion is a brief reference to something else that's used to deepen or broaden the point, to bring the idea from elsewhere and to let it color our understanding of this text or poem, or in our case, a Kinnah. In Kinnot, the allusions are to Tanakh, Midrash, Megillat Eicha, and many other rabbinic writings. So we want to keep our eyes peeled for allusions to other aspects of Judaism that we might recognize. The Kinnot also use alliteration, which is the repetition of an initial consonant sound. So that's the big blue book, right? That's alliteration. And then there's also imagery, in particular sensory details that we want to look out for. And juxtaposition. This is a major one that's utilized in Kinnot. It's when you place two ideas or things next to each other in order to make a point. In our case, the Kinnot oftentimes are going to put two contrasting things next to each other in order to show how different they are from each other, how different the reality or the pain of the Korban is from something else. We also want to consider pronoun. Who is speaking in the Kinnah? To whom are they speaking? And what emotional experience does that then give to the Kinnah? We want to notice repetition, which words, ideas, phrases will occur multiple times over the course of the poem. Those are going to be key ideas. And we're going to look for rhythm and rhyme, which are repeated patterns of sound or repeated sounds at the end of the word. That's what rhyming is. And finally, we want to look at structure, which is the format of the poem through the stanzas it uses, the verses it has, and what texts it repeats. 4 of these, you'll notice, are in bold: acrostic, alliteration, rhythm, and rhyme. The reason why they're in bold is because these are going to be things that we will only be able to identify if we're looking at the Hebrew of the Kinnah. Other things, allusions, different kinds of things about the structure or repetition of ideas or words or phrases, those things will be evident when you look in the English, as well as if you would look in the Hebrew. And the reason why I point this out is because I believe that the Kinnot are best understood and the poetry of the Kinnot are best seen in their original language. So I challenge us to look for these literary devices in bold in the original. And when we want to access maybe the more content kinds of the content aspects of the Kinnah, that we can also look inside the English. So I'm going to put those literary devices back up when we do our independent work so that we can look at them all together. But just to get us started, I wanted to give an example of the kind of work we're going to be doing from the Midrash. So this is not a Kinnah, but you'll notice that on page 1 of your source sheet, there's a beautiful Midrash that shows up in the beginning of Eicha Rabbah. So it's going to be the 11th section of the 11th Midrash in Eicha Rabbah, and it's basically a commentary, Midrashic commentary on Eicha Rabbah. And I believe that this is really the idea that the Kinnot ended up getting modeled on. And this Midrash is actually, as we're going to see, modeled on Eicha. So what we're going to identify is that the poetic tradition that we are functioning in now is actually a line from beginning with Eicha through rabbinic literature, through kind of Geonic or medieval, and then modern Kinnot that have been written are also continue to follow this tradition. So let's take a look at this Midrash all together. This Midrash opens with what we call a petichta, which is a little a verse that begins the conversation or provokes the idea for the Midrash in the rabbi who is teaching it. It's kind of like an association. And so Rabbi Yitzchak begins this Midrash with the following, based on the following pasuk. It's from Devarim, from the Tochachot. And it says, Tachad asher lo avadata et Hashem Elokecha, b'simcha uvetuv levav merov kol. Since you did not worship God with joy, with a whole and happy heart, when things were good, basically, merov kol, you had everything. V'avadata et oivecha asher yishalchenu Hashem bach, and therefore you need to serve your enemies that God sent against you. You have to serve your enemies bera'av uvetzama uve'erom, with thirst and famine and nakedness, uve choser kol, and you now are lacking everything. And this petichta opens up the rest of the Midrash because it utilizes a very important literary device of juxtaposition. right? So it's using an allusion, a reference to a different pasuk, but that pasuk is holding this idea of juxtaposition, putting two things next to each other to make a point. And what this is, the function this has is to contrast. It has to contrast reality. The contrast, the opportunity you had of serving God in joy and happiness. And it uses very similar language or opposite language or parallel language in the next line to show the direct contrast between what could have been and what is. It could have been that you were avarata et Hashem Elokecha, worshiping God, but instead avarata et oivecha, you're serving your enemy. You could have had simcha uvetuv levav, happiness and a whole heart, but instead you have ra'at sama uve'erom, you're naked and hungry and sad, and instead of being meirov kol, serving God with everything, bechoser kol, you are missing, you have nothing, you have nothing. And this leads Rabbi Yitzchak to write out this very, very long, you'll see it goes from page 1 to page 2. I helped a little bit with the color coding. It leads him to write this very fascinating midrash, where each line, we're going to see this repeating structure, each line begins with, Ilu zachitem, hayitim korim baTorah. If you were worthy, you would have read in the Torah, and then it gives a pasuk from the Torah. But now you are no longer worthy. Harei atem korim. Now you are reading, and then it has another line. So we're ready to open it up to the audience already, I think. What do you notice about this midrash? What does it seem is being done here? What literary devices can you see? How is this midrash written in a poetic way that really underlies its main message? Give it a shot. Amanda? Oh, you're muted, Amanda. Amanda, you're muted. Oh, I have to unmute you? I'm so powerful. There you go.
So I think what the author is trying to do is display that it's sort of like he's saying over and over again, you're not worthy because of all these reasons. It's like he's listing, it sort of reminds me on Pesach when we like Dayenu with all the reasons why it would have been enough. This is like the opposite. This is like all the reasons why you're not worthy and what you did wrong.
Okay, so you're noticing that there are many verses, right? And so there we have like a plethora of comments here. Great. What is limiting or structuring, let's say, the number of verses that we have here? What do you notice about the way that it's written? I now have made everyone able to unmute themselves, so I invite you to unmute yourself if you would like.
It's an acrostic, isn't it?
Yeah, it's an acrostic. Like we mentioned before, we have this tradition of using acrostics, although interestingly, this isn't a normal acrostic because
it's reverse.
It's reverse, right? This goes from taf to shin. So you'll notice that in each pair, you have a taf pair, a shin pair, a resh pair, and then a kuf pair. It gets a little fuzzy over there at the end, but we have it reversed. It's backwards. And these are not just, and this is not just any acrostic. The second line of each says, "Achshav shelo zachitem, harei atem korim." Now you're reading. What are all of those verses? It doesn't give a citation. I think it's because it assumes that we know the citation.
Are they from Eicha?
They're from Eicha, right? All of these phrases are from Eicha. And so what it does is it's actually lifting the Eicha acrostic, inverting it, but it's lifting verses from Eicha. And what it's doing is it's saying, now you're stuck reading Eicha. This is a line from Eicha. Had you been worthy, you instead could have been reading this line from the Torah. And what's the relationship between the line from the Torah and the line that's described in Eicha? it's fascinating because when you go through each one, which we're not going to do together, what you notice is that thematically they're also related. It's going to be a verse that uses a letter, the same letter from the Eicha verse, right? Because we're keeping the acrostic. But not only is it keeping the acrostic form, it's also keeping the theme from Eicha. So we'll just do one or two examples to just show what I mean by that. So let's look at the Reish example. Ilu zachitem. Had you been worthy, hayitim korim b'Torah, you would have read the pasuk from Sefer Shemot, right? All of these pasukim are from the Chamisha Chumshei Torah, from the 5 books of Moses. And this pasuk here is God seeing, Ra'o ra'iti et oni ami asher b'Mitzrayim. That's God talking about how God sees Bnei Israel's suffering in Egypt, and this is what initiates God to rescue them. So God's saying, I saw what happened. But now, now we're reading Eicha, and what does Eicha say? Re'eh Hashem kitzarli. God, please see that we are in pain. But this cry we know is in vain. And so instead of God seeing us, we wish God was seeing us. And so it not only finds a pasuk that shares the letter, but it's going to find a pasuk that shares the theme. Similarly, the Tzadi verse, had you been worthy, you would have read in the Torah, tzedek tzedek tirdof, pursue righteousness righteously, right? Do the right thing. But now, shalo zachitem, we read in Eicha, tzadik hu Hashem, right? God is righteous because we rebelled against him, and that is the only response that we have to horrible things happening in the world, is that God must be just. Right, because this is a big theodicy question. How could these things happen? The response of Megillat Eicha is that it's beyond us. We assume that God is righteous. That when we don't pursue righteousness, right, when we don't do what's right in the world, that leaves us with these questions of theodicy, and we have to assume that God is going to take care of justice, which is not exactly the way we want it. And so we really could probably spend forever and a half going through just this midrash and looking at all of the amazing ways that it makes these plays on words or themes or ideas through allusions to other places in the Chumash, through sharing letters. However, we're not going to do that, just this. We're going to move on. But before we do that, I want to point out one other aspect of this Kinnot. What's the pronoun? What's the voice here? Who's talking to whom?
Sounds like God's talking.
Yeah, it sounds like God is talking. It's the voice of God, and God is speaking
To us?
To us, right? Literally to us, which is fascinating because that voice transcends time. Right? It's above time that God is speaking to us with the words of the Chumash and with the words of Megillat Eicha, and telling us that we nowadays could have been reading Chumash, but we have to be reading Eicha. And that speaks to me really strongly on Tisha B'Av, when we're not allowed to study Torah. Right? This really is speaking to us now. We only can be really learning Megillat Eicha and a few other things like the Kinnot, because we're not allowed to learn Torah. And that voice of God is speaking to us as we are sitting here right now. And that gives an additional weight to the message of Rabbi Yitzchak, because he's basically saying that this isn't just about them, this is about us right now. That it's up to us and our zechut to determine what our circumstances and situation is, and it really brings the voice of God down to us. So this is part of the power of the way the poetry works.
Ora?
Yes.
I don't know if this is one of the techniques, but it looks like when I was going to school, they used to talk about makbilot in the VM, like parallel parts of, and this looks like an extreme version of it.
Right. So the difference between makbilot and this is makbilot would be in a navi, within a navi speaking, that the navi would say what sounds like the same thing 2 times, but it uses slightly different words each time. And so some people think about that as just kind of like the literary way that Nevi'im would speak, is they just kind of like use synonyms and it sounded like poetry. Very interestingly, Metzudat David was a commentator who actually went through all of these parallel structures in all of the prophets and actually explained how each specific word meant something unique, and all of these doubles were there to teach us something specific. He was speaking in a very particular context. In Germany, he was actually speaking out against people who were negating the sanctity of the prophets and of the Torah in general, and he was trying to prove that all of these parallel structures themselves are holy, which is a very interesting way to think about and to learn Nevi'im, particularly Nevi'im Achronim. In this case, it's slightly different because it has that same idea of parallelism, but these are different, like disparate texts that are being aligned, that we are kind of quote unquote artificially putting next to each other to make a point. As opposed to when you learn the Nevi'im Achronim, it's the Navi themselves is speaking in a double language. Although definitely that would be a literary device that we would maybe think about as repetition. Which we're going to see examples of in other Kinnot that we look at. Any other questions before we move on to the hands-on part of our class? Questions, comments, concerns? Usually I pause to take a drink to give people time to unmute themselves and respond, but I'm not going to do that today. So I'm just going to awkwardly wait. Okay, feel free to chime in if you do. So I'm gonna, in a minute, we're gonna go into independent work time, where we're going to take a look at the Kinnah that we have in the source sheet on page 3. It's Kinnah number 7. It's by Rabbi Eliezer HaKalir. We're gonna talk about him in a brief moment, but we're gonna look at, on my source sheet, it's page 3 and 4 in the Hebrew. And then if you want to look at the English translation, which I strongly encourage you to do so, it's on page 5 and 6. This translation is taken from these Kinnot of Rav Soloveitchik, which are excellent and amazing. And we'll go over how we're going to do that again together. Before we begin, I just wanted to say a brief note about Rabbi Eliezer HaKalir. He is a very enigmatic figure. We're really not quite sure who he is, and we're not even so sure when it is that he lived. But what we do know about him is that he was the piyut master. He wrote poems, Hebrew poems, more than probably anybody else in Jewish history. His piyutim are used on many chagim, including high holidays. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur piyutim were written by him. And he wrote the majority of our Kinnot. He is a gifted poet. I guess you could kind of think about him as like the way Shakespeare is to a sonnet. That's how Rabbi Eliezer HaKalir is to Kinnot. And one of the things that makes him such an interesting paitan, or person who's writing the Kinnot, is he is really the first to use Agadah so heavily, to use these legendary stories in the Talmud and in the Midrash in his piyutim. And so he really takes these stories and enmeshes them into the historical perspective that we had up until that point. And he also, he's actually been criticized by later Rabbanim for how complicated his Hebrew is. So that's just to give everybody a pat, just be gentle with yourself. The Hebrew is unreasonably difficult. And so he is the author of many of our Kinnot, and he is the author of the Kinnah that we are going to look at together. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to give you like 5 minutes of quiet work time. I'm going to put on the screen our 10 literary devices to look out for. And I invite you to just see what you find in this Kinnah, both in the Hebrew and in the English. And what I will also say is there is a school of literary thought which believes that poems are meaningful in what they mean, only in as far as what they mean to the person who reads them. And what that means is that, yes, I'm going to resend the source sheet, but what that means is that anything you find is right. So we're not going to be shy about what it is we find. We're going to, and I very rarely say that, but we're going to just do our best to try to find things. And when we come back together, hopefully we'll be able to share what we see with each other and build a deeper understanding all together. So I'm going to post in the chat one more time the source sheet. And I'm sharing on the screen the literary devices, and we're going to give everyone 5 minutes of quiet time to analyze and annotate Kinnot number 7 by Rabbi Eliezer Kalir. It begins, right, Echa Atzta, Zechor Hashem Mahaya Lanu. This is one of our famous Kinnot.
Sorry, Ora, I just came in a little late. We're looking
All right,
at
number 7.
Number 7.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. We're going to take 1 more minute. So keep looking for a little bit longer, and then we'll come back together. Okay. Hello, everyone, again. Let's get started. Does anybody want to share anything that you noticed about this Kina?
I found a couple of the easy things, I guess. Alphabetical, but it seems to skip. It's every other, is that right?
Okay, good. It's almost every other.
Oh, I see. Okay, I missed.
You want what can you just say?
Well, it's every. I just didn't see that it had. I thought it was Aleph then Gimel. I didn't see the bet, the Dalet. Like I didn't catch that part.
Yeah, because it alternates, right? The first line is Aleph,
Right.
then the second line is bet, and then we have a bet in this third line.
Mm-hmm.
It's this whole section is going to be bet. Oh, it goes the other way because it's Hebrew. This whole section is bet, and then we have Gimel, and then all of this is Dalet.
Right.
Great. Okay, so we have acrostic again. Super.
And the rhyming, obviously.
Great. We have our rhyming. It's interesting. It's a unique kind of rhyming because it's not a. I see you, Mordechai, 1 second. It's not a rhyme like each couplet itself rhymes. They actually all have the same ending sound. So echa, over and over again. So that is even one step stronger than rhyming, I think, which I would call it maybe rhythm, right? Because it has that same repeating sound, rhyme over and over again. Awesome. Mordechai.
It always starts with like Eicha, and then it goes in the alphabetical or somewhat alphabetical, like every other, well, mostly alphabetical alliteration that it does. Like Ansata, Be'apecha, Le'abed, Adomim, like there's often like a letter before it, and then like it goes to.
Fantastic. Great job, Mordechai. So yes, each section starts with the word Eicha. But then within each line, Mordechai is noticing that we have alliteration, that it's not just an acrostic, that there's one Aleph, one Bet, one Gimel. Each line actually has 5 uses of that letter, right? Which when you then see it, it becomes even more intricate, right? That we have Aleph, 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 Aleph. The next line, we have Bet, 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 Bet. And then we have a final, let's say, bet or dalid on the last line. Fantastic. So we have alliteration and eicha. I want to pause for one moment to talk about the use of eicha, the word eicha. Eicha shows up in many of the Kinnot in many different ways, and it obviously is an allusion to eicha, Megillat Eicha. And similarly to the acrostic form that we borrow from Megillat Eicha, the fact that we use the word Eicha is incredibly important because Eicha really is this challenging word. It's this word of challenge to God. How could this happen? And what's so complicated about Tisha B'Av and Megillat Eicha is that it really is questioning God. And it's surprising, but at the same time, so part of the experience of suffering that we're allowed to ask God, Eicha, how could you let this be? That we challenge God, that we say that we don't understand, that it seems like things are unjust. And that tradition of challenging God, it's called like a radical tradition. It seems like something that is totally not traditional, right? In a traditional way, but we do challenge God. And yet though, when we do challenge God, we tie our personal theodicy challenges to a tradition. That we're not as if we're the first people to think of, or have these problems with God's justice or be bothered by something God does. It's okay that we have those challenges, but we're consistently going to tie that into the long tradition we have of other people, Yirmiyahu HaNavi, who challenged God by using that same word. And so the fact that we use the word Eicha over and over again is an allusion back, and therefore a permission to challenge God almost. And it becomes very important in this piyut specifically, because what's this piyut all about is we're challenging God. We're basically telling God, how could it be that what would you say? What's the repeating refrain? What's the refrain here over and over again?
Zachar Hashem Mahayalanu.
Zachar Hashem Mahayalanu. God, remember what happened to us. That also, by the way, is a quote from Eicha, chapter 5, verse Aleph, right? Verse 1. My verses in Psukim get all confused with my divinity school training. so we have this challenge of saying, like, God, do you have your notes right? Like, are you remembering accurately? I don't think that you are really remembering the real things that you should be. And so the form that each of these paragraphs take is Eicha. How could it be? And then the line describes horrible tragedies that were part of the Horban. How could, using the alliteration, how could it be that you allowed this to happen to us, since Loza, right? And Loza Harta, you didn't remember. Then the next line of each stanza is something beautiful from Jewish history, something from our historic relationship with God that was lovely. And we're putting those things next to each other. We're juxtaposing them. I see you, Mikey, 1 second, right? To say that they don't make sense together. How can our current reality be understood in juxtaposition with this memory that we have? And then that brings us to the third line, which we see repeats over and over again. Uvachein, something. And all of those words, if you look at the translation, what are all of those words? All of the words in the Uvachein line.
Speech.
Ira?
Speech.
Speech. There are certain kind of speech, particularly a painful or upsetting kind of speech, because our reality is not matching up with our history. That leads us to cry out. And what are we crying out? We're saying, God, Zachor Mahayalanu, remember what the past was, because that should bring you to act differently to us in the future. And that's the structure that repeats over and over again with different examples throughout this Kinnah. Mikey, you had a comment.
Sure. I think you took us to a much more interesting place than I was thinking. But I was just thinking about the overall structure of the different historical events, as you mentioned, like the Lo Zachartas, bring juxtapose the destruction of the temple with a historical event. It starts off in chronological order, actually, right? Like Lo Zacharta starts with the first one's Brit Bein HaBetarim. The next Lo Zacharta is about getting to Har Sinai. Getting out from Egypt, I think, something like that.
Ananei HaKavod, yeah.
Right, and then gets to Har Sinai. It gets to I think getting to the lands, right? Most likely is what the reference is. The was it the Viud, I think, is the one, or let me just.
It spends a lot of time talking about Har Sinai, but it also then talks about the Beit HaMikdash. It talks about
but then it gets to the Beit HaMikdash. It gets to the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, and then sort of falls back on Har Sinai a lot, right? Then it basically gets to the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash and then sort of steps back to Har Sinai for the rest of them, pretty much all of them, right?
Which one are you talking about as the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash?
Let's see. I'm just looking at
in the English. I don't know.
English. Okay. So Egypt is the second one. The third one seems to be about the some of the places that could be the Midbar, could be Har Sinai. Wedding vows to Chorev, obviously Har Sinai, right? Is the next one.
Yeah, the whole middle section I think really is Har Sinai.
It stays there, right? Which is really interesting. Like, he doesn't go any farther than that. Which I thought was an interesting sort of focus. Because what the next step would be, is, at least if you're talking the Brit Bein HaBetarim, right, which Har Sinai is not even in there, but if the next step in the history would be after the Midbar would be getting to the land, and we're not there now. So I wonder if
it stays pretty much at Har Sinai. The only maybe difference is there is one paragraph that might be about the Beit HaMikdash. It's how could you not remember the beautiful temple songs, but otherwise it does stay at Har Sinai. I think that probably has to do with the fact that it focuses on moments of Brit, on covenant, right? That it starts with the Brit Bein HaBetarim, and then and because it's highlighting memories that relate to the covenantal relationship God has with Bnei Israel, that is epitomized at Har Sinai, which is why I think the Kinnah spends so much time at Har Sinai. It's focusing on that because that, I think, either it furthers the theological problem. How could these horrible things happen? Not only have we had this lovely past together, but it was a covenantal past that we had together. And it seems like God, it seems like you violated it.
Makes a lot of
Which
sense.
is, I think, why it stays at Har Sinai for much of the Kinnah. What else did you notice? Anyone else?
There was repetition of Echa and Velo.
Yes, Echa Velo, right? And that feeds into the theme here that we have of like, how could it be that this is things happening? Velo, not just Velo, but Velo Zacharta, you didn't remember this event. Fantastic.
I found that it often, like, in the sentences, there was repetition, not with the actual words, but like how the words ended. Like Icha atzata be'apecha le'abed biyad adumim amunacha, and then the next one's Icha gedarta be'atzarta, like so on and so forth, like that.
Fantastic, fantastic. Mordechai, if you look at, I have it color coded on my one in the screen. It's not just that there's alliteration at the beginning, but actually the structure of each section repeats over and over again in a way which, this is going to sound very weird without words filling in, but the structure of each repeating section is, how could it be that you, right? How could you, God, right? There's some kind of like, how could you something, right? With your something to do this thing to your people. And then you also have biyad over and over and over again. Biyad here means by way of or through this action. But you did not remember this thing, asher, that you blank, that you did something for your something. And so then we'll oftentimes have this last thing is for your, is going to be a synonym for B'nai Yisrael, right? So it's hard, difficult in the abstract, but when you see it in the specific, what you see you repeating is like this, how could you, it's a blame, right? How could you do this with your thing? And then through the messenger of biyad, by way of something else, right? And you didn't remember this people that you worked on, right? You did something for us. And those are going to be here in the suffixes, which Mordechai identified, right? That the suffixes repeat because we keep bringing it back to God, ta, right? You, cha, belonging to you, right? And that's going to repeat over and over again through this section. And that brings us to the question of pronoun. Who is speaking here to whom?
Well, I was going to say also, they each also end with uvechein v'koneinu, uvechein chivinu, ilanu, lahagnu.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, and that is us, right? We are taking this action, right? So who is speaking in this Kinnah? We are. The people who are reading the Kinnah are speaking. And who are we addressing directly? Ata. Who's the Ata here? Right? It's God. Right. And this is an inversion in a way of the midrash that we saw, where it's God kind of saying like, this is fair. This is the back and forth, right? This Kinnah is very differently written in our voice, challenging God through our tradition, through using the word echa, and through using our memory, our historical memory, and saying, right, like, this isn't consistent. The brit we have with Hashem is not consistent with what we're experiencing now. And that history enables us to speak directly to God in such a challenging way. And that is, he wants to hear people's input. Interesting. So I think maybe, right, that like it's about us speaking directly to God. And that is incredibly empowering. And I think there's also part of that is by giving this rhythm to us and this pattern to us that we could repeat over and over again. It actually is written, the poem is written in this way in order to empower us and help us feel that we have the framework to approach this conversation with God and be able to be presumptuous enough, but empowered enough to actually begin to combat God in this conversation. And I think that's incredibly, incredibly powerful. There's one other point that, is there anything else that somebody else wanted to raise? I wanted to raise one more point about something in the text, but I can wait if somebody has something else they want to contribute. Ira.
I just had a thought that what's interesting about this Kinnot is that there's no imagined reply from God, and that's really Eicha. You know, God has no speaking role in the entire Megillah. But I seem to remember from this morning, the little that I paid attention, that there were some Kinnot in which, at the end, you know, there's the last verse in which God does respond and says, you know, yeah, I hear you, Rachel, and I'm going to, do something about it. But I think most of the Kinnot end exactly this way, which is unresolved, and that's really the way Eicha ends.
Yes, absolutely. But just to point about the end, there is a little, you'll see at the end of this, there's a little paragraph that's like in smaller font. That's probably not even, that paragraph is probably not even part of the original Kinnah. It was probably written to be a paveway, like a bridge to the next Kinnah by later on. So we could actually even discount that. But I think even to strengthen your point, Ira, is I think especially considering the fact that a theme of this is our speech. It's not just that we're saying it. We keep saying over and over again, we're communicating with you, God, in this violent way. Dibarnu, konenu, chivinu, right? We're calling, and there's no response from God. So I agree very much with the point you just made, and it does feel very similar to Eicha, which is maybe part of the tragedy, is that we don't really have an answer to these challenges that we have about the way we've been suffering. Lily, did you want to say something? No, I just imagined you were raising your hand. Okay, any other comments? I wanted to draw your attention to a very strange, what I thought was a little bit of a strange section in the Hebrew. In the English, is on page 28, on my page 6, on the Kinnot, page 218, it talks about, remember the glorious crowns with which you bedecked your servants. It talks about these crowns. And so this is an example, a beautiful example of how Rabbi Eliezer HaKalir uses Midrash in his Kinnot. What are these crowns? So there's two things in rabbinic literature that are considered Bnei Israel's crowns. One option is Na'aseh v'nishma, that these were crowns that were given to Bnei Israel at Har Sinai when they said, we will do and we will listen, one crown for each word, Na'aseh v'nishma. These are the crowns that are given to Bnei Israel, which makes sense with the Kinnah being very focused on Har Sinai. And the second in rabbinic literature is tefillin. That tefillin are considered the crowns of Bnei Israel. They're worn, on the forehead. And what's interesting about both of these crowns is that they're not about power. That we normally think about crowns as being a sign of the power of the one who wears it. However, both of these crowns, the point of them is to remind us that God is above us. And Na'aseh v'nishma is our commitment to do whatever it is that God asks of us. And what tefillin are is it's this constant reminder of God and how God took us out of Mitzrayim and our relationship with God. And it's interesting that when Rabbi Eliezer HaKalir picks out the image of crowns, the crowns that we've given is that when we accept God over us, our crown is actually not a sign of power in the traditional sense, but is actually a sign of submission to God and recognition of our unique role in our relationship with God. There are many things that we can continue to speak about in this Kinnah, but I'm paying attention to the time and to the fact that if we even did another Kinnah together, we would be way over. And so instead, what I would love to do is give you the tools now in the next 5 minutes to, if you so choose, over the rest of this very long afternoon, to begin doing your own poetic analysis of some Kinnot yourself. And I've chosen 2 that I think are uniquely well suited. There are many more that I'm happy if you'd like to email me or I'll stay after. I could recommend others, but there's 2 that are basically the rest of this very robust source sheet that I think are uniquely suited to this kind of analysis. The first one is in Hebrew on page 7 and 8, in English on page 9 and 10. And it's Kinnot number 13 also by Rabbi Eliezer HaKalir. And you could take a look at it to find its structure, but it's a ko, which is, I didn't realize literally until this year, a ko. Where is the ko? It's echa, right? It's a play on the word echa. And what he does in this section is he goes through all of the places the word ko appears, or many places the word ko appears in Tanakh, and he brings those into conversation with the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. So I strongly recommend taking a look at that. If you take a look at that, make sure to also have open Tehillim Perek Ayin Daled, because the last line of each stanza is drawn from Tehillim Ayin Daled. I think that's clear on the English section, but thinking about the way these two things are texts are juxtaposed might be very, very interesting for you. So that's one to take a look at. And the other is also a great favorite of mine is Eish Tukad B'Kirbi. It's the B'tzeiti B'Mitzrayim, B'tzeiti M'Yerushalayim section. It has many features to find, to dig into: acrostic, rhyme, refrain, just juxtaposition. It's really all there. And the reason why it was important for me to give this class is because I really think that this is, now you have a toolbox, and that you should be empowered to spend time doing your poetic analysis on the Kinnot, that ultimately they really are accessible if you invest the time with an English translation. And through doing that, I think you can unlock some really beautiful riches inside each of these Kinnot, such that the next time that we recite them, maybe they'll be able to actually evoke within us the sense of awe or appreciation or sadness or pain that's really intended by the poetic devices. And really my ultimate dream would be that we continue to write Kinnot, that we take these literary devices, the way they use allusion and repetition and refrain, and that we become inspired to think about the pain that we experience in our life and write within the traditional style, the same way that we take acrostic and we take the word echa, we take our tradition and we apply it to our modern experience. And that for us to be able to write a collection of modern Kinnot so that we could really have a poetry slam on Tisha B'Av, maybe not morning, but afternoon, that we could take our ideas and our pain and put them into a poem that can be understood within our great tradition. That really, I think, is the ultimate dream. And I think this is the first step. I'm so excited if you do choose to spend time this afternoon analyzing these Kinnot or other Kinnot. If you have thoughts you want to share with me or insights that you discover, I would love to hear them. Please feel free to email them to me. And not that it's been a pleasure, it's been a great sadness and pain to learn with you this afternoon, but I appreciate the time, and I hope everyone here has a meaningful, inspiring, and passionate experience of Tisha B'Av.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Can you share the literary devices in the chat?
Yes, I can.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ora.
File. My computer. Where are they? Here they are. Open. Okay. I just shared them in the chat if anybody wants to download them.
Oh, that was amazing. You're so
Mommy.
awesome.
Thank you, Mom.
Thank you again. It was really beautiful.
Thanks for joining and contributing.
Good fast, thank you.
Som Kal, everyone.